Well, hello everyone, and my thanks to Alistair and Jacob for the invitation to be here. It did feel a bit strange getting on the bus earlier today for various reasons, one of which is that I'm going to an event called Living Freedom to talk about obedience, but you'll just have to bear with me there. I thought I'd talk about 3, maybe 4 things. I'll talk a bit about the argument of the book. But for reasons that will become apparent soon, the word argument isn't really the right word to use, because it's not an argumentative or polemical text, really. It's more an exploratory text. I then thought I could talk a bit about that exploratory nature of the work, talk a bit about the style in which it's written and why it's written in that way, a kind of post hoc justification from all the people that have asked me why on earth am I writing about such weird things. And then I'm going to talk a bit about some of the raw material I used in the book, which again has upset some of the people that would normally like the themes in the book, which are things like obedience, discipline, duty, loyalty, and these things. But a lot of the people that are into those things don't want to read about the raw material that's in the book, which is illegal raves, environmental protests, time spent on traveller camps, growing up on Greenham Common, etc., etc. So my advice to anybody who's thinking about publishing a book is don't try and combine social conservatism with long stories about illegal raves, because it won't sell very well. Because it's 2 different constituencies, and one constituency don't want to hear about the other. But it happens to be a cusp point that I inhabit myself. And then, time permitting, I will talk a bit about what is to be done from the perspective of the book, because lots of people have asked, and I think it was alluded to by Jacob's own review of the book. Where do we go from here? What are you suggesting we actually do? And I've been asked, what are your policy proposals? And strictly speaking, I don't really have any. The book isn't there to give policy proposals, and that's okay. But people do need to know a bit about what it might mean to be on message with what the book's trying to say. So in terms of the basic idea here, as Jacob was saying, when we say freedom today, particularly in a post-Enlightenment or modern/postmodern context, people usually assume the term freedom means an absence of restraint, a limitlessness, a freedom from others imposing on my own self-will. Similarly, when you say obedience, if people don't immediately stop listening, which they often do, those that will last a few minutes longer will be assuming that obedience is an exertion of power and control. Somebody abnegating your will, usually against your own choosing, and often under threat of violence or some kind of intimidation or exertion of power. So obedience and freedom are usually taken as mutually exclusive things, understandably. That's our default, that's our setting, that's the cultural presuppositions within which we live. They are the presuppositions. And you can see that exclusivity in the relationship between the two to a certain extent with COVID, which I'm sure has been on discussion, and lockdowns. People were forced into a position of obedience under threat of legal consequences if they did not obey, and therefore they lost their freedom. What this book is saying is that obedience is a much, much richer, more wide-ranging and more fertile concept than simply abnegating the will against your choosing under some kind of threat of violence or coercion. The term obedience originally, in its ultimate etymological roots, comes from a Latin verb, obedire, which means to listen to, or to pay attention to. In Greek, it's hupakore, which comes from the verb to hear, and the preposition meaning under, i.e. to stand under what another is saying to you, i.e. to understand what's being said. And if you go back a lot further in history, the word obedience has a much broader range of meanings than what we take it to mean today. It includes all kinds of tacit and implicit and unspoken and unwritten decisions to go along with things which are deemed necessary for the good of the community in which you live, as well as your own good. So it's a kind of attentiveness, originally, an attentiveness to what's required by the situation in which you find yourself, not merely obeying external commands under threat of some sort of control. I would say obedience is best understood most deeply, primordially, abstractly, as attentiveness, and an attentiveness to reality. And when you're attentive to reality and the situations in which you find yourself, the people around you, your networks of obligation, your networks of association, your family of origin, your family of association, the culture to which you belong, the place in which you call home, etc., there's an awful lot of acceptance required. Acceptance of limit. To be human is to be limited, by definition. It's to be incarnate in space and time, and therefore to find yourself under unassailable limits all the time. So really, I would say, ultimately, the thing that holds a lot of the interest in the book that's come my way together is understanding obedience as an attentiveness to human nature, the realities of human nature, and the realities of being human. So a lot of the things I talk about in the book are things which are traditionally or classically conceived to be at the heart of human nature. So I talk about child rearing, for example, which involves a lot of acceptance of limit. And the people that have said this book is full of drudgery and duty and all this kind of stuff, I've been able to explain that a bit by saying I wrote a lot of it when I was on paternity leave, after my wife and I welcomed our third child into the world. So when I did manage to snatch a few hours at my desk, I was thinking a lot about duty and drudgery and how there had to be some kind of meaning in this. This can't be just pure coercion, which of course there is. I'm not saying that only those who have children have meaning in their life. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying a healthy, flourishing, I hesitate to say normal because I'm so affected by working in a university where the word normal has now been cancelled. But most normal societies are those in which there is a certain celebration of and making space for child rearing as something very important. And that's not just important on a kind of scientific level because we're a mammalian species and therefore we are kind of geared and configured to procreate. It's also important because human beings have a natural, they're kind of hardwired for profundity and joy and grief and longing and sorrow and all these things, and bringing children into the world brings all that with it. And it becomes very rich and saturated with meaning. But it does involve an awful lot of limit, an acceptance of limit, and realising you are not free to do the things that you used to be able to do. But you're free and a whole new rich dimension of existence is opened up. Similarly, I talk about loyalty, much more in the context of living among and taking responsibility for those in need, as in elderly relatives, which in our culture today is seen as something that's a massive impingement on people's freedom and something that people shouldn't have to do. And I've lived in a multicultural society for most of my life, and it is very much a culturally specific reaction to what one does in that kind of situation. And I've taught young people now for 5 or 6 years and worked with many young people of a different culture where it's a given. It's a given that you would sacrifice some of your freedom in order to have a healthy, flourishing family community at home which welcomes those who are in need, those who are vulnerable, those who are perhaps disabled, etc., and those who are elderly and need care of people around them, care from people around them. And I think that's what makes us human in many ways. If you look at many animal communities, when people become a hindrance to the survival of the community, when animals become a hindrance, they're just cast aside. It's just an acceptance of what we are as human. We're able to evince loyalty for each other. Similarly, I'd say, in inverted commas, I think it's a problematic term, there is such a thing as a human dignity that belongs to us. So one of the things I talk about in the book is deference, which really annoys people. But the point I'm making in the book is that we've lost our sense of intrinsic dignity on the basis of our humanity because we live in such an aggressively meritocratic or supposedly meritocratic society in which human dignity is always relative, or often perceived to be relative, to the position we occupy on the socio-economic spectrum. And that's what I'm trying to argue against. And I'll talk about the raw material I used in order to do that shortly. I'll try not to go on a tangent now. I also think human beings are different and special and human by virtue of the fact that we evince love. So I talk a bit about that. And I also talk about how, until relatively recently, in the Christian marriage rite, it said love, honour and obey. And of course, the word obey had to be removed. And the word honour is often removed as well, because it's deemed intrinsically toxic. But actually, to love another person is to accept that you can't completely subsume them within your own identity. It's to honour the limit between you and that person. and that other person is a bearer of freedom. They're not there merely to fulfill a desire that you have, and yet you feel called to stand next to them and to be alongside them, traditionally, in a permanent relationship of some sort. So again, the flourishing that comes by virtue of love, I would say, is only achieved through an acceptance of limit. And then another example I'll talk about very briefly is mutual understanding. That's what makes us human, and it involves a lot of acceptance of limit. And here I have particularly in mind the fact I work in the humanities department and have had to reflect a lot on the place of the humanities and what a complete state they're in many places. And part of the problem with this is an increasing conviction among many who work in the humanities, bizarrely, that you can only fully relate and understand to stuff which mirrors your own cultural context in life. This is the thinking behind decolonising the curriculum. If people can't recognise their own cultural context or ethnic context in a curriculum, therefore it can't apply to them or move them or be interesting to them. You can't be interested in history unless it's your history. You can't be interested in literature unless it's your literature. You can't be interested in music unless it's your music. And I say your, with inverted commas, because this completely goes against one of the core convictions of there being such things as the humanities and the arts and culture, which is that we can be profoundly moved by people from completely different cultures and backgrounds than our own. That's why we have art. That's why we have theatre. That's why culture exists, ultimately, because you can read something written by someone who lived a long time before you or lived in a completely different place and has a completely different experience of life, and they can articulate your hopes and fears. So there's a human universality, and I think we're losing that. And the reason I think we're losing that, unsurprisingly, is because of the weird world of identity politics. And that's in the background of the book a lot. And I had for a long time wondered what it might be like to try and work out my views that were sort of vaguely political. And it would mean arriving at a strange kind of left-wing conservatism of some sort. But I was really provoked to do it because of the, what I would say, long march into complete and utter insanity that I'm witnessing in the sector in which I work, which is universities. And I've been thinking for a long time that what's at the core of identity politics aren't these particular issues about which we will argue endlessly. There's something much more fundamental, something primordial, I would say something theological going on here, definitely philosophical, which is a profound antipathy to limit. That's what gives us identity politics, I would say. And I would also say the roots of it are found ultimately in economic neoliberalism, and I would say it's Margaret Thatcher writ large upon the soul. I was told to be provocative, so I'll do my best. And if you look at a lot of the debates in identity politics, you can see this refusal to accept limit all the way through. The most obvious example is that one of the most primordial, fundamental, inescapable limits of being human is being apportioned as a member of one of the two halves of the human family, i.e. to be male or female. Prior to the ultrascan, what's the first thing you say when a baby enters the room? It's a boy, it's a girl. Limit. Not that, but this. Or not this, but that. So go right in at that limit. Go right in on it and start using language like gender assigned at birth. And then the limit is gone. And the limit is conditional on that person's will and self-identification and choosing. And gender assigned at birth also goes even further into the limit that happens when the sperm hits the egg, at which point the differentiation begins and says there is no differentiation, there is no limit. There's a gender that's assigned at birth, and then whatever happens to be chosen, which can be a gender without limit. I'd say even, I was told to be provocative, even language of people of colour worries me a bit. Because I think it's prefaced on the possibility of self-identity, i.e. not ascribing to someone a particular identity because it might not be the one which that person self-identifies as. But I found it difficult, and maybe it's a reflection of my age or something like that, but I grew up in the East End, and I had black friends and Asian friends, and I know how this sounds, but the fact was that was just the way it was, and the idea of there needing to be some kind of inability to accept the limit that you might get that wrong, or for the other person to accept the limit that other people might make mistakes, and that's okay, and that's just part of life. We now have to adopt this language for fear of committing microaggressions, etc. A friend of mine was saying at the Freshers' Week welcome for students at their university, they can't do the initial greetings now when they come into their department. It's a creative writing department, so it might be particularly acute, I don't know. But they now can't do greetings when they come in. The staff will go, shh, and give them a sticker and a pencil, and then they can write their pronoun down for fear of misgendering. So even that initial exchange is territorialized, politicized, as some kind of silent, restrictive, limitless kind of space. And I could go on and on about this for ages, but I would just say identity politics gets us to the position which is exactly that mutual exclusion of obedience and freedom I talked about at the beginning. All freedom, self-expression, be what you want to be, nobody can oppress me, I can be whatever I want, and then you get into a position of what I think can be quite genuine oppression as a result of that. That's freedom leading you into exactly the kind of obedience that people don't want. The kind of obedience that's born through, not through tacit and implicit acceptance of social norms, but comes about by coercion. And we see that coercion in the society we're living in. And I'm still in a state of shock. I should get over it now because it's 2022. But I'm still in a state of shock that I'm living in a society where I'm less free to speak the way I want to than I was as a teenager in the 1990s. I'm still amazed by that, to be honest. So a couple of comments. On one level, this all sounds incredibly conservative, and it is socially conservative in the broad sense, i.e. the kind of values I'm talking about are traditionally perceived to be conservative. And some have said it's reactionary, because I'm trying to go back to some kind of pre-identitarian understanding of the fundamentals of human nature, which we're losing increasingly at the current time. And some have said it's reactionary because you're asking people to go through a kind of willful forgetting of everything that's imposed on them by the society we're living in, etc., etc. I wouldn't agree that it's reactionary at all, because I'm not talking about going back. I'm talking about refounding new understandings of these things. But it was interesting to be accused of wanting a kind of willful forgetting, because there is an element of that in the book, insofar as the genre and the style in which I wrote it was really kind of storytelling. So I tell stories about these weird experiences I had in the 90s and the weird communities I lived among in the 90s. And storytelling is an act of forgetting. It's a kind of willful suspension of disbelief to enter into a world different from your own. And I just did that because that's the way I've always done political writing. But I do find that when you think about the extent of change of digital technology, identity politics, COVID and everything that's brought with it, that you don't have to look very far back in history, and it is quite haunting to see how much everything has changed. Things have radically changed very, very quickly. And that sense of vertigo or being bewildered or overwhelmed by change is a classic kind of conservative or reactionary, almost a genre of writing, which is there, and I do accept that. But I really just wanted to write something with soul. And that's partly because I'm an academic, and the way academic writing is evaluated through a particular process called the research evaluation framework is directly and explicitly inhibitive of expressing oneself with soul. But I also think the world we're living in, full of identity politics and digital technology and everything else, is also inhibitive of soul. I just wanted to write something that had soul, that had humanity, and that's why I did it in this way. And as I said earlier on, I used as content and raw material various alternative subcultures that I'd lived among and known in the 80s as a young child and in the 90s as a teenager, by which I mean, as I said, things like Greenham Common, what are called New Age travellers, ecological protests, illegal raves and things like that. But the thing was, because I spent so much time in that world, I had seen temporary autonomous zones without explicit rules and without explicit laws, populated by libertarians who were probably of a kind of left libertarian, if they were caused to articulate it, kind of hue. But generally I saw when people are in a situation where they're not coerced to behave in a certain way, people generally get on okay. I've witnessed it. I've lived among it. I'm talking about situations where the police were not involved at all, legality was not involved at all, temporary autonomous zones without coercive law in which people had to find their way through and deal with things like justice, etc., as they went through. I'm not uncritical of that world, and I do say much in the introduction, much of what I learned from it I have learned in a sort of negative way, because there were lots of problems with it as well. But strangely, I do think that that world did teach me a lesson as a young person, that the relationship between obedience and freedom isn't mutually exclusive, and I don't think it should be understood as mutually exclusive, because anybody in one of those communities had already undergone a tacit and implicit acceptance that the well-being of the community required a certain acceptance of limits on their part. And that acceptance of limits fits within that broadest definition, that richest definition of obedience. So I've seen situations where obedience is freedom, and I would hope very much so that I might see such experiences again one day. I'll leave it there.